All right, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon for Making Meaning of Minnesota, Immigration, ICE, and Civic Action. I am Jody Agius Vallejo. I'm a professor of sociology at USC and also associate director at the USC Equity Research Institute, and I'm so pleased to welcome you all here. We'd love for you all to introduce yourselves in the chat so we can get a sense of who we are in conversation with. So please, um, share your pronouns, whether you're a student, faculty, staff, community member. You can tell us your major, your department, or where you are joining us from. And I'd like to just take a quick moment for a quick housekeeping and accessibility note. So you can enable closed captioning by clicking on the live transcription button at the bottom of your screen. And I also just want to give a big thank you and shout out to our incredible ERI staff who've worked tirelessly to help us organize this webinar today. Kim Tabari, Rhonda Ortiz, Deborah Gata, Paris Valoria, Eunice Velarde Flores, Lauren Portillo, and Gladys Malaviran. Thank you so much for all of your work. So I'm going to begin with a land acknowledgement and really emphasizing that we at USC are located on the ancestral and unceded territory of the Tongva people whose ancestors ruled the region that we now call Southern California. And we pay respects to the members and elders of these communities, past and present, who remain stewards, caretakers, and advocates of these lands and river systems. And as we recognize this history, we really also have to grapple with what it means to live on stolen land, to commit to supporting the struggle for Native nation sovereignty and self-determination. And I want us to just take a moment to consider the many impacts, past and present, of colonization, genocide, slavery, violence, displacement, migration, and settlement that bring us to this point where we are at today. And so we share these acknowledgements to pay respect to the original caretakers of the land for past, present, and future generations, to really raise awareness about histories that are too often erased or forgotten, and really to affirm our commitment to racial justice and social change. Feel free to add your native land to the chat. If you're in California, you can click on nativeland.ca to look up whose land you're on. Okay, so again, thank you so much for being here today. We are really at a pivotal moment in the struggle for justice in the United States. And right now, immigration policy is not only a tool of governance, it is a vehicle for authoritarianism. And it's being used to expand state power and state violence, to normalize dehumanization, surveillance, and repression, and to militarize everyday life and really erode our civil liberties. What has unfolded in Minnesota is not a localized crisis, it's a national flashpoint. And it's a moment that reveals how immigration enforcement can function both as an instrument of repression and as a catalyst for political awakening and collective resistance. And so we thought it was really important to ask, what can we learn from leaders in this moment of crisis and response? How do movements organize when cities are occupied, when enforcement agencies are regrouping and expanding into cities across the country, and when the government is rapidly trying to expand its reach by building new detention sites and warehouses across the country to disappear people and suppress dissent? So, as federal strategies shift and intensify, what can we learn from Minnesota and our local responses? What does collective action look like, not just for resistance in the short term, but for transformation in the long term? Before I introduce the panelists, I want to welcome my good friend and organizing partner and poet laureate of the city of Anaheim, Camille Hernandez. She's going to share a poem with us. And Camille is the third poet laureate for the city of Anaheim. She was actually named last year one of the 125 most influential people of Orange County. Her writing explores devotion, dogma, tenderness, and the fluidity of intimacy in communities targeted by American imperialism. She's the editor of the Anaheim Poetry Review, a fellow at the Watering Hole, and she just published a new book of poems entitled Motherlands. So, Camille, before you share this poem that you wrote for us, I want you just to take a minute or two to explain how your art is related to the immigrant rights movement and why art is so incredibly important during times like these.
Thank you so much, Jody, and thank you very much, everyone, for having me. How does my art relate to the immigrant rights movement? First and foremost, I'm the daughter of an immigrant. My mother and my family immigrated from the Philippines, and it's a long, complicated history. But every time the U.S. is lacking in jobs, they pull Filipinos for domestic labor, and that's how my family for generations have come here during the nursing shortage. And so I write a lot about devotion and dogma and tenderness, and I use the guise or the lens of family relationships. And as a first or second generation immigrant, I would say, I, my context and understanding of family is my own, and I'm one of those people who I will not be apologetic. I will not try to explain away my dignity or my living, but I will show you how the dynamics of my family and my people, whether they are my Filipino side of the family or my Black side of the family, how we have survived and how we continue to survive in the collective. Um, and on the purpose of art being important during these times, um, in times of chaos, the role of the artist has always been to name and identify, whether that is visual or cinematic, literary, or through performance art. The artist is the one who shines the light. Not only the light of what's going on, but to shine the light of a vision that will hold us into the future. And sometimes it's that palatable light. It's something that we can hold together and dream towards. And sometimes, in the case of Octavia Butler, it is the honest truth. And many times, us artists deal with the Cassandra complex, where we will tell and we will prophesy, and we are unheard, but the art still is made. So our responsibility is always to reveal what's going on, and that's antithetical to censorship and authoritarianism. And for us who are immigrants and children of immigrants, it is our art that proclaims who we are in space. And I'm thinking right now of Toni Morrison, and she has her essay Peril in the book The Source of Self-Regard, which everyone should read because it's her writing against fascism. Um, she says a writer's life and work are not a gift to mankind, they are its necessity. And so I understand that poetry is dignity, and as a poet, my tool is language. And since language is the first tool that is used to oppress and to dehumanize, I am taking the foundation of what is violence, what justifies violence, and I am transforming it and alchemizing it into the movement of freedom. And so, with that, I'm going to read a poem to you all. It is called I Write Freedom Songs Because I Couldn't Learn My Mother's Language, a three-part harmony. 1. It is like the man begging the stars to deliver a muse who will rescue him from a drought of inspiration. He cannot tell a new story without confronting histories with its legs crossed before him. With crusted eyes and worn-in hearts, he squeals a deal that disappears into the nothingness of a dream, refusing to hold a mirror to itself. Sing to me, O muse, he says. And what he hears are maggots and bones that he called a country, slippery as sperm, truthful as the empty offering plates said in prayerless rooms. And I was like him once, grazing these Americanisms like rosary beads, until the muse lay gaunt. My language is incarcerated from the stories we were forced to swallow, with more parasites than people. My country is a plate I prepared for my ancestors, and every day I read the rotting and build a new vocabulary from this paradox of disgust. 2. What loneliness can I feed to this ravenous apocalypse? Because we are made of stardust, we carry the instinct of freeing ourselves by way of oblivion. I too am a tired black thing, ready to consume all that exhausts me. I respect the kindness of cataclysm, sustained in the sweetness of solidarity. Perhaps the stars that we pray to stare back from the future, waiting for us to commit ourselves to its fury. 3. When I call my power back to me, it gives us the stories needed to ungrammar ourselves from the civil cage of language. Do you remember the people blubbering away, sprinkling words like fire and light into a sunless vocabulary? Every tongue travels through its mother's pelvis, and you were the womb men stuck their blades into for just one taste of honey. O Muse, give us language from the liquid and gold beneath your breastplate. We press ourselves against the new worlds found in your embrace, you wild and violent thing. I told you I love you, and I want to crack the atlas bone holding this world together. I beg and cannot find you. Are our invitations not the beating drum, or have you done enough? When does inspiration flee and the well run dry? Can love wither on its own vine? Why am I stuck in the rules of this great grammar of being? I grasp at each one of a muse's teeth that fall, and I will form a new jaw from the stubbornness and bite into a government of honeycombs, crackle the blades and bars and systems until all that's left is the flattened wax that I once called order. Keep your teeth, sweet muse, and hold your sisters, and I will form my lips to pronounce the plural of change. I thought the silence was your absence. I thought the noise was you laughing at me. But now I taste your weeping breath, gasping in every tender-aged prison. All this potential and yearning because we thought we needed you to move us. But inspiration is a puddle evaporating on the surface of strategy, the I-beam of our backbones bracing for impact and sharpening the blades of who we need to become for each other. Thank you.
That was so powerful and brilliant, Camille. Thank you so much for sharing your art with us and for being such an important part of the movement for justice. So now I'm going to introduce our esteemed panelists. We are so fortunate to have four extraordinary panelists with us today, bringing expertise in immigrant rights advocacy, research, grassroots organizing, and rapid response leadership. And so, in the next hour, we're going to hear from them about how communities are responding to the pressures of this authoritarian moment and how strategy, solidarity, and collective power are being built in real time. So, I'm going to share a brief introduction. Some will be offered in the chat. Thank you so much, Kim, for your work on monitoring the chat. Please follow our panelists and learn more about their work. So, I'm just going to begin in alphabetical order. Amaha Kassa is the founder and executive director of African Communities Together. So Amaha has 25 years of professional experience as a labor and community organizer, nonprofit director, and social entrepreneur. For 9 years, Amaha directed East Bay Alliance for a Sustainable Economy, a workers' rights nonprofit in Oakland. And Amaha has earned his law degree from the University of California, Berkeley, a master's in public policy from Harvard Kennedy School, and he's also an immigrant from Ethiopia. And now I'd like to introduce Dr. Irene Vega, an associate professor at the University of California, Irvine. Dr. Vega's research examines U.S. immigration enforcement, border policing, and the institutional culture of the U.S. Border Patrol. She is the author of Bordering on Indifference, Immigration Agents Negotiating Race and Morality, which is an ethnographic analysis based on interviews with Border Patrol, ICE officers, and people who work in immigration enforcement at the borderlands who are mostly Latino. And I have to say that this book is excellent. It is an excellent and really important read considering what we're seeing and experiencing right now. The book really explores how agents make sense of their work, their race, and their moral responsibilities. And so Professor Vega's scholarship offers really critical insights into the expansion of the immigrant enforcement state and its implication for democracy and civil liberties. Next, I'd like to introduce Wintana Melekin. She is the founder of Groundwork Minnesota, which is based in St. Paul. And she became a community organizer after attending a protest for Trayvon Martin in 2012. She's been deeply invested in movement building ever since. And Wintana has over a decade of experience passing policy, advocating for civil rights at the local and national level. Her work spans successfully electing champions for justice into local, state, and federal offices, to leading voting rights coalitions to restore the vote and end prison gerrymandering in Minnesota. She's a believer in representative democracy where everyone's voice is heard, regardless of race, religion, class, or sexual orientation. And she centers her life around the creation of joy and fighting for justice. And really, Groundwork Institute is an extension of that philosophy in action. And next, I would like to introduce Sandra de Anda. And Sandra de Anda is the policy director of the Orange County Rapid Response Network in Southern California. She is an expert in not just organizing rapid response, but in policy and working on the ground in coalition with local communities, organizing elected officials, and academics. Sandra also manages the daily rapid response operations of the Orange County Rapid Response, as well as legal responses with families, helping families work participatorily in their own defense and in strategizing around immigrant rights. So we are so fortunate to have these amazing panelists with us today, and I would um, like to now turn it over to my compadre, Manuel Pastor, who is Distinguished Professor of Sociology at USC and Director of the Equity Research Institute.
Thank you, Jody. And thanks to the panelists for being with us. I gotta start by talking a little bit about uh, what happened in Los Angeles in June of last year when the raids broke out here. Certainly ICE has always been active, but in the first few days, like many people, I was moving between providing data to organizers and groups and participating in marches, and then being a little bit caught up in some street action that I didn't really expect to be caught up in, but was caught up in. And one thing I noticed standing in front of City Hall in a moment in which rubber bullets were shot and tear gas was lobbed and horses with cops on them charged the crowd was that while there was a group of people who were clearly educated about ICE, had a kind of political agenda in the best way. There was also just a lot of working class Latinos who had showed up, who were upset about their neighbors being snatched, about their families being disrupted, about their communities being torn apart. And I wrestled with the fact that there really was as much of a political reaction, a sort of civic reaction of neighbors, of communities asserting who they were. And in some ways, at least from afar, it looks like that's come to full blossom in Minneapolis and Minnesota. Certainly, people with a political analysis, but also multiple entry points for people to just do their civic duty of protecting their communities. And so I feel like we're at a really profound moment for movement building, because that first step for movement building is when people enter civically and then along the way develop the political education, the political analysis. So to me, this is a tremendous moment. And I actually want to start with that. I'm going to give you a lot of space later to talk about how you all built this. But to just ask you, what is the mood in Minnesota? And I say Minnesota consciously because I know it hasn't just been Minneapolis. It's been St. Paul, it's been the suburbs, it's been the rural areas. What's it feel like to defeat an occupation?
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction. So like you shared, my name is Wintana Melekin. I'm based in St. Paul, Minnesota. I'm sorry for the stuffy nose. I caught the flu. I feel like my body just was like, you can't take anymore. And to talk about what it's like here, I have to talk about kind of what we've been through. I am a proud community organizer. I have been organizing for the last 2 decades in the Twin Cities. I've organized around housing justice, immigration, voting rights. I've been in the fight for a really long time. And I'm a proud immigrant, immigrated here, born in Sudan, but I'm from Eritrea. And when this all started, it really was Thanksgiving Day. It was a tweet from Trump. And I've been telling people this story because I think it really matters. But I became paralyzed that day. I actually ended up leaving social media and became a very private person. I've never been that. I've occupied our local police station. I have led protests on freeways. I have been very principled in my beliefs and been very brave my entire life. And this completely paralyzed me. It gave me a fear that I just couldn't handle. One of the few privileges I have is that I am a US citizen, and I've always been proud to know that I would use that privilege to stand up to folks who have a different status than me. And those first few weeks, I was invisible, completely locked away, unclear of what to do. And then day after day, people in my own family started getting picked up by ICE. We watched all immigrant communities, but really a hyper fixation on Black immigrants really get violent and racist and extreme in the streets. And I completely changed my entire direction and have been giving my all to this fight for the last about 70 days, and have just been in the streets ever since then. And I will say nothing feels different. There might be a national story that ICE has left that is untrue. ICE is still here. ICE is still picking up my neighbors. I have had my own family members' immigration hearings get moved up a month ahead. One got moved to Thursday and then got moved a month away, and it's just been complete chaos inside the immigration system, the judicial process of it all, but also in our streets. Anyone who is telling you that ICE has left, maybe some of the officers have gone home, but our folks are still disappearing. Our folks are still locked in their homes. Our business corridors are completely destroyed because there are no workers and there are no customers. And it is just as bad today as it was when it first started. It just is different now. The ICE agents may not wear army fatigue. They wear regular clothes. They've been putting button or bumper stickers on their cars that say, more pro-immigrant leaning things. So to seem less and less ICE visible. But we have seen, we still have the same amount of deportation flights going out. We still have the same amount of folks in detention. Our folks have not been released. And so, yeah, things have not changed here.
Well, so that's really important to level set us with two things. One is what's really going on right now. And the second, it's brave to talk about being paralyzed because I think that so many of us, how we move from paralysis to action, how we find our courage. And so anyway, I really want to thank you for sharing that. I think it gives people more opportunity to be honest about their own fears and their own entry points. Um, Actually, want to jump to Amaha next. And the reason is, I'm a data nerd, as you know. And so I calculated that if you rank the states by the share of the population that's immigrant, uh, that Minnesota comes in at 24, and Maine, which was also a target, comes in at 45. But if you rank the states by the share of immigrants that are Black, Minnesota comes in at 2, and Maine comes in at 7. So, as Quintana was sharing, there's a particular specificity of anti-Blackness in this particular set of attacks on the immigrant community. So, can you talk a little bit about how Black and African immigrants are experiencing this moment of enforcement and why it's so important not to erase the anti-Blackness as we talk about, rightfully, the xenophobia?
Yeah, thank you, Manuel, for co-creating the space for this conversation, and huge thanks and gratitude to Wintana for her leadership and the ecosystem of grassroots leaders that she's been working with in the Twin Cities and Minnesota as a whole. If anything, Wintana's understating the kind of decades of work that has gone to create the infrastructure for the current response that we're seeing. It's yes, there's spontaneous sort of neighbors turning to neighbors, but it's built on the infrastructure of like trained leaders and organizers that Wintana and others have been creating for decades. Um, I and I think what you're saying is so important, Manuel, around the intersection of xenophobia and immigrant exclusion and anti-blackness. And there is a through line that when Tana talked about this kicking into high gear in November of this past year, but there's a through line that goes back through Trump's slur against countries as shithole countries, and saying if Nigerians come here, they're never going to want to go back to their huts. In his first term, going back to during his first campaign when he flew to Minnesota in the wake of a tragic death that occurred in order to scapegoat the Black immigrant communities for supposedly ruining Minnesota. And that wasn't he was trying to win votes in Minnesota. It was because it was performance. It was a performance for the base and a catering to a level of xenophobia and anti-Blackness. And I think that we are looking at the hyper focus on that intersection is, again, in some ways there's historical continuity, throughout U.S. history, going back to the trafficking of enslaved Africans at the very beginnings of this country. But we're also looking at something of a new development because having led an African immigrant organization since 2012, there were a lot of times when I was trying to explain to people about this intersection and to say, no, this is not some optional constituency, right? But there's something about the American racial caste system that tends to position Latinos and Asians as perpetual foreigners, perpetual immigrants, no matter how many generations they've been in the US. And it's very important to the perpetuation of the American ideology on race that Black people are from nowhere, that they do not have an origin, that they do not have an origin story, an immigration story. So we were for much of my history in this work, we were invisible, and we would say, we need to make our community more visible. Well, be careful what you wish for. We are now hyper visible, and very much in the crosshairs and at the center of this strategy. I just want to make one other observation, which is one thing that I think the immigrant rights group movement has not done a great job at historically is talking not just about enforcement and the targeting of undocumented or temporarily documented or contingently documented groups, but really shining a light on the strategy of nativists and forces to throttle legal migration, because
Yeah.
that has been something that they have been crystal clear on since since they first took office, and it has everything to do with the changing demographics of the US. It has everything to do with the fact that most countries in the world, including the US, have declining real birth rates and declining populations, and people see the sort of historic model of American citizenship with, European men, see that becoming more and more of a minority. And that's why you see marches like Charlottesville talking about replacement and replacement theory. And so we talk about xenophobia, but it's never been a question of keeping immigrants, particularly Black immigrants, out of this country. The U.S. has been dependent on the labor of migrants since as long as there's been a U.S. It's about being able to exploit that labor with a population, a subcaste that doesn't have political rights and that doesn't have the power to bargain the terms and conditions of their employment. So that's what we're seeing is the reification and consolidation of that ideology into a political strategy.
So important to put this in perspective. Another uh, sort of long-term, and by the way, the one thing I would say I'm having thought about this as well is they're perhaps less scared of immigrants than they are of their children and the inevitable transformation of the United States. I want to turn to Irene because the other thing that we've seen is this incredible level of enforcement and this shoveling of dollars under the so-called big, beautiful bill to feed this deportation and detention machine. How do we understand this moment in enforcement? Is it a rupture with the past, or is it really a long-term continuation of institutional patterns? I know we were talking before, a lot of times people want to say that these violent acts are being caused by new and poorly trained agents, but the facts come out that these are people who've been in the system for years, and that this is, in a way, the face of the system really showing itself. What's your reaction to that?
Thank you, Manuel, for that question, and thank you all to my co-panelists and the people who have joined online for being part of this conversation. Yeah, the way that I think about this is very clearly as an escalation of really long-standing historical institutional patterns within the coercive arm of the immigration bureaucracy, the Border Patrol and ICE. We have not long known these agencies, in particular the Border Patrol, to have issues with overstepping their authority by using excessive force, using various forms of coercion and misinformation to get people to sign removal orders without full information, detaining people in ways that violate their own policies. So the seeds for this kind of escalation were planted really long ago. But I think it's worth mentioning some of the specific factors that I think primed these organizations for doing what they're doing right now in Minnesota, as well as in other parts of the country. So the first thing that I want us to really think about is this long-standing organizational culture with regards to use of force. So these agencies are first and foremost law enforcement agencies, and in that way they reflect the broader issues that we have seen in American policing, including discriminatory practice and excessive force, right? So particularly problematic here, and I think we've seen this in Minnesota and in other parts of the country, is what policing researchers have called the warrior mentality in policing. This is a hyper-aggressive posture produced by this idea that police officers are trained into, that the public is inherently hostile, dangerous, unpredictable, and that really their life is on the line every day that they go to work. This is how police officers are taught to understand their work at these academies. And so they have to be hyper vigilant, distrustful of the public, and also think of the public as out to get them, right? And so the kind of approach to policing that this results in the US is these stark us-them boundaries between police officers and the public, and also leads to that aggressive policing and excessive force that we're seeing in Minnesota and in other parts of the world, right? And so part of the answer to the question about escalation is just this long-standing culture around use of force in policing more broadly, not just in immigration policing, but now we're seeing this in these particular agencies. Then the second thing that I want us to think about is this bureaucratic structure that has long failed to regulate police behavior and has even encouraged problematic behavior, not just right now through this undertraining and mistraining that we're talking about, but in longstanding issues with transparency and accountability. So, for example, we can just go back just 1 decade ago, right? But these reports have been ongoing. The American Immigration Council published a report in 2014 where they analyzed formal complaints against the Border Patrol between 2009 and 2012. The complaints ran the gamut from physical to verbal to sexual abuse. And when they analyzed the data, they found that not only were almost half of these cases not decided on, they were pending, but of the cases that were decided, 97% of those complaints filed against the Border Patrol had resulted in no action taken, meaning no disciplinary action was taken against agents accused of various forms of abuse. The agency reran these numbers more recently, and the number has budged to 95% of these cases have resulted in no action taken, right? So yes, current agents are undertrained and we've reduced the training. Vetting has not been conducted with the same vigor, but these institutional issues around excessive force, abuse of power are long-standing. And then the final thing that I want to talk about in regards to escalation is how high-ranking political and bureaucratic leaders have signaled both rhetorically and materially to agents that the guardrails are off. So, for instance, 2 months into the Trump administration, the Office of Civil Rights and Civil Liberties within the Department of Homeland Security was terminated. This was the unit within the Department of Homeland Security that, however imperfectly and incompletely, was meant to advise the Department of Homeland Security on these abuses of power, violations, and then refer cases to the Department of Justice when criminal conduct was suspected. That mechanism is now gone, as other oversight roles are also gone and subject to layoffs and major reductions in people and resources. Donald Trump called these agencies, these oversight agencies, internal adversaries that slow down operations. And so this is a bureaucratic, not just rhetorical signaling, but really a reduction of oversight that allows agents to use excessive force without accountability. This is in addition to the statecraft around the shootings of Renee Good, for example, and Alex Preddy, where within hours, high-ranking leaders, including the president and vice president of the United States, called them domestic terrorists within hours of their shootings at the hands of these agents. And so together, these three things, a culture of exceptionalism around force and power, a bureaucratic structure that has failed to rein agents in, and then executive leaders and politicians escalating rhetorically and, really importantly, delegitimizing the admittedly weak guardrails that were there is what I think has created the conditions for what we're seeing today.
Thank you, Irene. I'm going to go to Sandra in a minute, but I want to stop with Wintana one more time. And first, I want to say that folks in Southern California have deep admiration for all your organizing, not just because it's brilliant, but because today in Los Angeles, it's a rainy day and we're frightened to go outside. And you all were out there in some pretty crazy weather conditions. Can you talk a little bit about what surprised you about the organizing that emerged? Certainly, as you said and Amaha said, it was built on decades of organizing, so it didn't come out of nowhere. But what was new? What was continuing? What was new? What was different that we should all be aware of?
Yeah, absolutely. So just to talk a little bit about the organizing that happened, um, Minnesota has a long history of protest. It comes from our very strong labor movement. We were the state to elect the first Black Muslim woman, first Black Muslim man. We are a state that has had a lot of the social, equitable things that you need, like access to healthcare and, welfare for folks who need it and all of that. And so, uh, we also have the highest voter turnout in the country. And so we just have a very high culture of civic participation. It's ingrained in almost every single part of the state. One thing most people don't realize about Minnesota is that we also have the highest racial inequality in the country. So while we every year get ranked of having the best park system, the best education system, we also have the highest rate of inequality. The wealth gap between Blacks and white folks is higher here than anywhere else in the country. And it's an odd scenario, to be a great state, but also struggle with that. And that actually is a big part of the backbone of why we have such a strong protest culture, resistance culture, is that we believe everyone. We have a famous quote from our former Senator Paul Wellstone: "We all do better when we all do better." It's like Minnesota's slogan at this point. And so we believe that, but we don't know how to practice it. That is like the thing that we're consistently coming up against. And so after the death of Jamar Clark, who was killed by the Minneapolis Police Department, we occupied a police station for 17 days. This happened over Thanksgiving. We hosted a Thanksgiving outside. We did food drives. So we kind of learned the skills. And then after the murder of George Floyd, we occupied the whole city, honestly. And then we still have an occupied zone called George Floyd Square on 38th in Chicago, which was actually just a few blocks away from where Renee was murdered. The George Floyd Square is still an occupied zone to this day, 5 years later. Um, so it's just like inherently a part of our culture. We have a long history of community organizing. And so people honestly just did what Minnesotans already do, which is take care of our neighbors. There's all the political philosophy you could use, creating united front and all of that. But we just have a belief system in our state that you got to have folks back. And that was as simple as that. I think the thing that surprised me the most is that during the last uprising of George Floyd, there was a lot of movement conflict and a lot of disagreements that destabilized our state. I think we learned a lot from that last uprising around how to be better partners to each other live in the moment, how to address conflict. And I think this time you saw organizations and neighbors who don't speak to each other, who don't traditionally work together, really stepping up and leading and figuring out better ways to resolve conflict for the greater good of this moment. I think of very clear examples. A lot of my friends are, suburban moms who Minnesota has a lot of Spanish immersion daycares. It's a thing that we have here where it's very popular. Transparently, it's very like suburban rich mom kind of thing. And a lot of these folks, you're talking about like some of the most like respected attorneys that you've ever met working at the Fortune 5. Minnesota has the most Fortune 500 headquarters in the country in our state. And like literally the attorney for one of the biggest corporations in Minnesota every single morning was driving her kid's daycare teacher to school every day and making sure she was safe. She does patrols. She just things people who are not even who have never even considered taking action in their life stepped up and led in ways I've never seen and were in clear coalition with each other in a way that we've never experienced. It superseded any political alliances. It superseded any race, anything. And I don't say that in a way to say neutral. We were far from neutral. We were very clear that we were dealing with authoritarianism and fascism, but all the lines were gone. We were all team protect our neighbors, and we were doing everything that we could from people who have the privilege and own 3D printing machines who don't like to leave their homes and just printed them in mass. Like I could post a tweet and saying, I need 100 whistles today, and somebody would print them and the color of my organization's branding and drop them off at my office. I could ask someone to give me Sky Miles to fly someone home. They would do it. Like the level of lack of ego and hyper coordination was just absolutely phenomenal to see. And I think it really was built off the backs of Black and brown folks that have been doing it for decades and decades and decades, trying to show Minnesota what it could be. And I think you saw the best of us. And it, as Amaha had shared, it came off of the legacy of the Black and brown organizers that have been, and the labor partners that have been doing this for so long. And it just caught us at a moment where we were so tired of the fascism that we just said no more, and we did everything that we could to protect our neighbors. We're talking about tens of millions of dollars was passed around community to pay the rents, to buy the foods, to buy the groceries, very detail oriented systems of finding, identifying safe people who could go and buy eggs and drop it off at the home of an undocumented person, people making sure that they never took the same route to take someone to and from work so that they could track if they were being followed, like just high level sophistication that was completely decentralized, that was honestly built off of the backs of the Black and brown and labor movement that already existed here, and then was able to be amplified by the learnings of the murder of George Floyd is what brought all of this together. And that I think was the biggest difference between our former movements and this current one.
This is very interesting about the continuity from the past, but then learning to not avoid conflict, but understand it's going to be there and work your way through it, to call people in and to provide them with multiple on-ramps to be part of it, and to identify a common threat to democracy. It's very powerful. Sandra, I want to go to you and talk a little bit about how this is also happening in a territory perhaps less expected, Orange County. Less expected for people who don't understand that Orange County has transformed demographically and politically, but I think for the rest of the country and even parts of Southern California, understanding that OC has stepped up in the face of this crisis. Can you talk a little bit about your work, the Rapid Response Network, and what you see on the ground in Orange County?
Yes, thank you so much to all my colleagues for sharing so much of your wisdom. I want to start off with just talking about what Orange County is, right? But Orange County, right, historically, has been a site of white flight, right? In the 1950s, we saw many white people uh, leave Los Angeles, right? And they set up shop here in Orange County. And there have just been decades of repression here in Orange County for people of color. I mean, I'm here in the city of Anaheim, which at one point, right, had such a KKK stronghold that is still very much alive. We have gotten right hotline calls of white supremacists basically threatening immigrant neighbors in the city. Um, and so, right, that stronghold of white supremacy is still very much alive, but it's much more in the liberal lens, right? So we take a look at our budgets, at city budgets, at county budgets, and rarely, if ever, you'll ever see a line item with the word immigrant in it. Immigrants there are for one of three people in Orange County, one of them is an immigrant. But right, historically, there has never been funding for immigrant communities. There have never been policies for immigrant communities. I believe it is now actually the moment we're seeing actually many immigrant rights policies come to fruition because people are now seeing what many of our undocumented communities have lived for decades, right? Surveillance and arrests from ICE agents. Um, And so that's something I wanted to share because it has been an uphill battle. Someone recently mentioned it's like the Cassandra complex, and I think that has been the work of the Rapid Response Network, right? Even before the year prior and this year, we began in 2017 creating the infrastructure for rapid response because we thought Trump one was going to be an effective deportation machine, which it was, but it was a almost silent deportation machine, right? Right now under Trump two, we're seeing much more excessive force, as Irene had mentioned. It's much more of a spectacle. And so basically we had began to create that infrastructure. We were still monitoring ICE right through Public Records Act's requests to see where it is in which cities that they were targeting different communities the most. I know under Trump one, we were also, you know, taking care of our neighbors, waiting in front of their homes at night to see if ICE was going to show up and things like that. But it's not to the level of where we are now with Trump, too, where we have seen very different tactics, right? Um, and we basically saw and I can say this in confidence, but Southern California really was experimental ground for enforcement for the rest of this country. And we have an amazing dispatch team that monitors our hotline. And on that hotline, I believe we have exceeded more than 10,000 calls in 1 year. But basically, people who are scared to call any other hotline will call our hotline and report specific, very specific activity. And then from there, you start to hear many neighbors report very similar activity. And then you start to see a trend. And then you start to basically ask yourself, what is happening? And I know one of those moments, right, was when we kind of saw escalation in back in March and April. We saw Homeland Security investigations targeting unaccompanied minors, but very quietly, right? But it wasn't until maybe 10, 15 folks throughout all of Orange County, throughout La Habra, Costa Mesa, Santa Ana, they're saying, look, there are some really weird guys coming asking very sensitive information about my child who is an unaccompanied minor. And we know that ICE often lures people. They often violate people's Fourth Amendment rights and also right this concept of curtilage, which is what they were violating at the time and getting so close to that protected Fourth Amendment area. So from there, we started seeing that escalation. We know people know their rights. Jody's actually also part of the rapid response team, but we started showing up and basically, right, offering rights to families, to schools, laying watch basically in the morning. That enforcement tactic ended. So then they escalated to courthouse arrests, basically targeting asylum seekers at our Santa Ana Immigration Courthouse. And this immigration courthouse, you really only know about it if you're going through immigration proceedings. Otherwise, you would have never known about this place because it's tucked away in buildings that are very business-like, but also there's a government agency there for the county, but it's very, very hidden. And, we couldn't believe, the calls we were getting that people were saying that there were masked agents. This was the very first time that masked agents were reported. I think they were reported one of the very first instances, right, in our country that we're hearing that there are masked agents. And so we had to go check it out. And it maybe a couple of minutes. And then we started seeing, I mean, basically saw 8 to 10 agents. I mean, myself and my co-director, a couple of the ICE watchers, we walked into the courthouse and you can see these 8 to 10 agents. They have the gators right here and they are behind these families these entire families. And they stuck out like sore thumbs because they were not part of a family unit. But right, that moment was very indicative, really, of the empire and those that serve the empire, and really a lot of men of color who are working class people, who may have been disenfranchised. And we had conversations with these agents. That's why I respect a lot of Irene's work, right? Having those conversations with those agents, understanding why they are there, why are they, you know, interrupting social reproduction, these families. And but basically that we ended up seeing kind of what were the things to come. That was like the very first time that we got a sort of indication of things to really change. We also saw vehicles and agents with G4S patches. So G4S are these security groups that have also been found in the occupation of Palestine. So it was, I like that when Tana said that, they were almost frozen, right, in all that was happening. And it was just for me very overwhelming to see that the occupying forces of Israel were here in Santa Ana, incarcerating entire families that eventually all got taken over to a facility in Texas. So for us, we were playing the Rapid Response Network really was responding holistically, um, but it was an uphill battle, really trying to persuade as many people that what is happening to those that are often overlooked, asylum seekers, many of them with less than 2 years, that it's worth to protect their rights because they will always begin there. When any force begins to violate the rights of those that are overlooked and individuals that are imperial system dehumanizes, then they will only just go up. So,
Yeah.
right, we started seeing, I was actually at the courthouse maybe 3 weeks in, that on June 9th is when the occupation of both the National Guard and then Border Patrol came to Orange County. That's when they started targeting people at bus stops, men of color, individuals at car washes, individuals, day laborers waiting at Home Depots. But basically, right, we started seeing the enforcement machine go after all classes of immigrants, not just asylum seekers. We started seeing these very open, right, very open spectacles of enforcement because there is also a story that's not being told, the enforcement that happens in the dark. So, the enforcement that happens at people's ICE check-ins, individuals that have been, waiting in line, doing things the right way, being taken, even though they have petitions protecting them from detention. So, for us, going back to that metaphor, it really our team was trying to wake up Orange County because our ICE watchers were diligent in trying to wake up our community that the monsters are here, but they have always been here.
Great. Thank you very much. I wanted to pick up on something you said about the people who are actually serving in these roles that are agents at this moment of inflicting tremendous cruelty, uh, disrupting families, uh, wearing masks, etc. And if we were to rank the number of questions we got prior to the webinar, uh, the number one set of questions would be for Wintana about what's going on in Minnesota. The number two set of questions would be to Irene, which is how come Latinos are ICE agents or Border Patrol? People who themselves have experienced marginalization in some form, often have relatives whose status may be uncertain or only recently uh, settled. Um, can you talk a little bit about how it is that people become part of that system and part of those values?
Sure. Yeah, the fact that, just so that we're all on the same page, right now on a national scale, about 51% of the Border Patrol are Hispanic or Latino, and 30% of the deportation arm of ICE are Hispanic or Latino. Most of these Hispanics are uh, Mexican Americans who grew up along the US-Mexico border. And so the fact that these are the demographics of these agencies and that they're still doing what they have long done reveals a lot about the power of institutional socialization. And really importantly, I think for our conversation here, but also broader conversations that we're having about policing in America, is that the idea that diversifying a police force is a way to make policing less discriminatory and even more humane, right? This is the assumption that runs through many police reform efforts. Now, I want to be very clear that I'm not saying that diversification of policing isn't a worthy goal. I think that we should aim for all government institutions to reflect the population that they serve. But what I really take issue with, and I think that we need to disrupt, is this idea that diversity is the kind of structural and cultural transformation that is required to improve things. We can't conflate demographic diversity within these agencies with structural and cultural change. Inserting people with different racial ethnic backgrounds into the same system will continue to yield the same outcomes. And that's what we've long seen in policing. And that's what we're also seeing in immigration policing today. So institutional socialization is a big part of that answer and the conversation. But I think that in order to really understand that socialization, we need to understand what comes before it, right? We need to understand recruitment into these agencies. How do we get to these demographics? And one of the primary explanations that many people infer is, well, these people are obviously self-hating race traders with some assimilationist desire, and that's why they go into immigration enforcement to police their own and to get acceptance from the dominant population. And I understand that explanation. I think we could have a whole webinar psychoanalyzing agents who do the state's dirty work, as well as discussing the politics within minoritized populations and these political and ideological divides that could produce these demographic shifts. But if there's one thing that I think we need to understand about the participation of minoritized populations in their own social control, and here I'm thinking specifically minoritized men, is that kind of assimilationist desire is not how we get to these large scale demographic shifts within these agencies. What does explain the recruitment of men of color into social control occupations, not just immigration enforcement, but policing, correctional officers in prisons, security guards in private security, has to do with broader and long-standing issues about educational inequality, uneven economic opportunity, and the proliferation and uneven recruitment of minoritized working class people into the military and into immigration industrial complexes. And so I want to just take a quick moment to think about these in turn. So military recruitment, right now about 30% of the Border Patrol or of CBP and ICE are veterans. The share of minoritized men who are military veterans in these agencies is much higher. The book that I wrote based on 90 interviews with immigration agents, almost half of them were Latinos. And working class communities in the US, including in these predominantly Mexican American border towns where the shooters of Alex Preddy, for example, came from in South Texas. These communities are saturated with military recruiters. In fact, there's research that shows that in working class communities, students have a higher levels of contact with military recruiters than with college counselors. And we know that working class communities have long turned to the military as a source of upward mobility. And so researchers studying this have talked about this as the poverty draft that the government leverages in working class communities and creates a culture of conscription amongst minoritized populations, minoritized men especially. And then once in the military, veterans become part of the military to policing pipeline. Veterans are overrepresented among the policing profession, and you can kind of link this to the warrior
Yeah.
mentality that I was talking about before. So, in addition to military recruitment, there's also a concentration of law enforcement jobs in the border region, where this primarily Mexican American region, not only because the government concentrates its immigration control resources there, but also because prisons tend to be sited in places with lower than average levels of education, higher than average concentration of poverty, and higher than average concentrations of racial minorities. And that accurately represents many places along the border and many places, many working class
Yeah.
places in California and other places.
Thanks.
So,
I'm trying to pay attention to the time.
yes,
So I'm going to turn to Amaha to
yes.
ask, um, this is called Making Meaning of Minnesota. And I know you spent a lot of time thinking about broader national movements. And I'm wondering what your reflections are on this movement moment and how it is that we can go from what has been a clear politics of no, of rejection of this level of enforcement, to some kind of coalition of yes for a different future. Do you see anything?
Um, yes, in a word. I think, and I was as I was uh, listening to Professor Vega's remarks, I was just reminded of the famous quote from the robber baron Jay Gould, who said, I can hire half the working class to kill the other half. And I think what we're seeing is a flowering of not just um, a nativist regime, but also of an extractive regime, right? Manuel, you and I were in a meeting recently where, I sort of laid the proposition that um, people bet on what's put on the table before them, right? And in recent years, there was a bet put on the table. I bet you that, people were asked to make a bet that if they subscribed to nativism, to open white supremacy, to anti-trans and anti-LGBT ideology, that would translate into um, better jobs, lower rents, more opportunity, affordable education, and all the things that everyone, regardless of their background, quite rightly wants for themselves and for their children. And so I think uh, you know, I think that whether you're looking at the micro level about someone making the decision to join CBP or ICE, or at the macro level of people joining this authoritarian coalition, I think it is. Certainly, there are dyed-in-the-wool sort of people for whom this is a closely held ideology, and then there's just a lot of people making bets. And part of what our collective challenge for immigrant rights movements, for racial justice movements, for labor movement and working people's movements, is to offer people a better bet. And so I think that's part of the challenge that we face in this moment is, and I'm coming to you from the roof of Terminal 5 of JFK Airport in New York City. But where we had this interesting moment within New York City politics where, people are being asked to make a different bet with respect to affordability. And there's a sort of very live political experiment going on as to whether that particular coalition will hold. I think the last thing that I want to just say about what this means for sort of the state of our movement and um, where we go from here. I think it's incredibly important that we learn and that we also don't learn the wrong lessons. So this moment and the not just the assault in Minnesota, but everything from the assault on law firms, the assault on the press, the assault on voting rights and civil liberties, the narrowing and almost abolition of the space for civil society, right? I'm a first generation immigrant. I've seen, societies like Ethiopia create a narrower and narrower space for dissent and civil society and organizations independent of the government, and we're seeing that strategy. All of this is in some ways testing the weaknesses and the contradictions of the work that we are all doing. We're getting hard questions put to us, like, um, you know, do you really have the depth of support and political education amongst the people that you call your base, where the siren song of white supremacy is not going to appeal to them? Are you able to mobilize people in mass at the scale that you need to? Are you able to take the institutional structures that you've built up carefully year after year, in response to 80 mandates from 80 different foundation funders and created this infrastructure around? Are you able to pivot in the moment to meet the actual needs of your community, regardless of whether they're what you put in your annual plan or your grant proposal? We are getting tested, and some of us are succeeding spectacularly. Some of us are failing spectacularly, tests of courage and tests of responsiveness. And most of us are doing a combination of both. And so, the point is that we got, it's not a one and done test, it's an ongoing test. And the last thing that I'll sort of say is, I was, about a year ago this time, I was part of a lot of conversations about what should we learn about this moment. And there were a lot of people deriving, frankly, the wrong lessons from it, right? They were saying, look, we focus too much on enforcement issues during the Biden administration and sort of pushing back, and we let abolish ICE become a buzzword, and we should have just focused on pathways to legalization, and we should have, done these things. Those voices are a lot quieter now, right? Because I think as abolish ICE has become more and more of a mainstream position, and for people who are thinking about what that means, one resource I would recommend is Peter Markowitz's excellent chapter on kind of a post-criminal immigration enforcement regime. It's part of Immigration Matters, the book. I have a chapter in there about legal migration and future flows. So I think that it's really important that we do, while moving, at the pace that the moment expands, do real reflection on what are we actually being taught in this moment, and how do we internalize those lessons and use them to transform our movements for the long.
This is such a rich conversation. And I always appreciate you. I particularly appreciate, I know that you delayed a plane flight and you're at an airport so that you could be part of this conversation. And it looks like you're freezing too. So I really, totally, I've always appreciated you, but loving you, brother. I wanna, we only,
Listen, if Minnesota can do it in -10, I can do it in 40 degrees or whatever it is, right?
I wanna bring us to a close with our two organizers. Quintana, I wanna ask you first, maybe 3 to 4 minutes. What do you really want those of us not in Minnesota, not in Minneapolis, to understand for our own work and how best to support you all in your work?
Absolutely. Thank you. I think about the best way to support Minnesota is to organize in your own state. Minnesota has been building movement infrastructure for a really long time. And I think I'll just say, outside of Omaha and a couple other nationals, a lot of folks wasted my time these last couple weeks. I have some personal vendettas now of people who wasted my time. And I don't think we need people to come here and just hang out. We need people who, if they do come here, come to organize and provide real support and infrastructure and add themselves to the existing work. But otherwise, the most important thing you could do is build in your own state. I think about one of the programs I built out here. I run a training org, so my organization is called Groundwork Institute, or C3, Groundwork Action, or C4. And I launched it in August. I joined the staff in November. 2 weeks later, ICE was in my state. And then I, in my personal capacity, just spent all my time responding to ICE. And one of the things that we built out is these micro networks based on the different skill sets people had. So we had one that was hyper focused on Eritrean Ethiopians. So there's something called Operation Paris, which was targeting very specific green card holders. That was where I saw a lot of my family be directly impacted. And so we built a little tiny network of people who could recruit attorneys and translators. We did know your rights trainings. We did one-on-one meetings. And so we did that. We built another specific network of artists who were, creating art all over the state. We created another micro network that was made up of attorneys that could file habeas on behalf of folks. So I would have situations where it'd be someone would get picked up at 8 p.m. and I could find an attorney who was a real estate attorney, actually filed a habeas for me at like midnight. And then like 5 days later, I think like 3, 4 days later, this person that had got picked up by ICE was released, who actually had a deportation order. So this is like an unheard of anomaly. And so we built these very small micro networks. We didn't build a fancy org with a new name and branding and a new Instagram, on none of that nonsense. Please do not do that. If I could give you any advice, it is not to build new things. It's to focus on the people who are already doing the work, get them the resources and the support. There are experts in your city who work in micro spaces. Figure out how you lift that up, figure out how you scale it up. That is where I saw the most success. Do not build a new coalition with new branding and all the things. It's a waste of your time. It brings unwarranted attention. It is just the opposite of what needs to be done. And so start looking, we have a very large, start looking for the leaders that are already doing the work. We have a large Karen population, but they're very under-resourced. So we figured out how to get them plugged in. This is the same thing. We just continued to figure out what is the micro population that's being targeted. Minnesota is a very white state, but we have, for the metro area where most of the folks live in our state, very high immigrant population. So we figured out what are the tools that everybody needed and we provided them. And we just gave away whatever we could to support that infrastructure. I think the other thing that you need to figure out for your state is about your elected officials. So we have a set of elected officials that were ready to move and were ready to do things. We had another set of elected officials that were completely paralyzed and didn't know what their role was. Some of those folks that I have seen in my political career who don't really step up and lead too often, over time, as they watched their neighbors get picked up and disappeared, started driving around and doing patrols, like became took their election certificate and kind of used it as like almost like a public resource, opened up their offices for folks to call them and tell them when ICE is nearby and sending out text alerts. And so that's one thing. And like section 1, focus on the micro organizing, stick to it. Section 2, figure out your elected officials. Some of them already know how to lead. Others are terrified, but are very well connected. Figure out their role and like invest in their role as much as you can. And then I think section 3 that is really important for you to do in your ecosystem is be very, very protective of the narrative. So folks are saying ICE has left. Minnesota orgs are repeatedly telling folks that is not true. We are pushing back on the national narrative. We are lifting up the stories of the local folks. So last week, I took 60 Minnesotans, partnering with an organization called Faith in Minnesota, took 60 Minnesotans to DC. We met with Schumer. We met with Jeffries. We met with our Republican members in Minnesota. We met with anyone who would listen, and we just repeated the stories. The stories of Juan, who owns a tow truck company in Minnesota, who has been driving around the state towing people for free. When ICE like rips them out of their car in the street and leaves it running, he tows it back to their house. We lifted up the educational staff at Liam's school. We brought them with us. We brought folks who had been picked up by ICE, who were U.S. citizens, who told their stories about how our detention centers are separated between citizens and non-citizens. And so, really, it's about protecting your narrative as much as you can and telling that truth. And we brought in a set of really smart comms experts who said, hey, we want to help you. We're like, great, pair yourself with these local folks who are so scared to even speak in public and help them feel safe and provide them the security that they need so they can tell their stories. And so those were kind of the three things that I think every state should take away is like keeping it hyper local, figuring out your elected officials, what they can and can't do, what their different expertise are. And then I think the third thing is protecting your story at all costs, because the national narrative will be whatever is clicky. And if you are
Yeah.
producing content consistently, and I hate to call it content, but that's the national narrative, that's the national
Huh.
media market. And then I'll just also add before I wrap up, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. We will gladly do meetings with folks in other states. I've already offered this to states. They're already calling us. I will gladly hand over information. I want to see this model not multiply
Duplicate. Yeah.
all across the globe. I want everyone to use this Minnesota model. I want to scale it. I think every state should kick ICE out of their community. And I think anyone should feel welcome to ask Minnesotans how we did it. We will gladly share that information.
Great. I'm going to go to Sandra for just 1 minute. I'm sorry, Sandra. I did want to say uh, thank you so much. This was not a waste of your time. And the thing I also would add to this is that figure out lanes where you could contribute. So one thing we did within a few weeks was to provide for both Los Angeles and Orange County data on undocumented mixed status families, industries that would be impacted, etc. It's not the most important thing, but it's a thing that we could be good at. So we've got students, we've got lawyers perhaps listening. What's the lane that makes the most sense for you? Sandra, 1 minute, and then I'll have Jody close us out.
Yes, I think what Minnesotans do well is the narrative work. Right now, really, Orange County needs a lot of assistance in understanding that the enforcement that from policing and immigration is interconnected. Right now, right, our sheriff has a policy that transfers folks from local custody to ICE. That has been a long-standing policy for more than a decade. But really, we cannot normalize enforcement, whether it is happening in the back, whether it's happening openly. It cannot be normalized because when we say it's acceptable to detain one, we say it's acceptable to detain all. I also want to mention focus on police unions. Police unions are the unions that are helping local police departments capitulate to ICE enforcement. We see this here in the city of Santa Ana, but throughout all of Orange County. But in Spanish, there is a saying, la policía la migra la misma porquería.
Okay. Um, to translate, the police migration is the same shit. So for those of you who didn't learn enough Spanish to appreciate Bad Bunny, you got your Spanish lesson for today. I want to thank again our panelists, Wintana Melekin, Irene Vega, Sandra de Anda, and Amaha Kassa, who's probably now trying to jump on a plane flight. And I'm going to ask Jody to come back on and in the last minute do some more thanks and close us out.
Hey, everybody. Oh my goodness. Thank you so, so much to all our panelists. Thank you, Manuel, for moderating for us. And a big thanks to the Department of Sociology at USC and the Center for Black Studies that both supported this work. Thanks again to our staff. And I just want to say that, what we've heard today is so powerful. It really makes clear that this moment is about all of us. It's about going from paralysis to courage to community mobilization. And thanks to all of you for being here today, for being a part of this conversation. And this work continues in classrooms, community spaces, of course, in policy arenas, but most importantly, in the streets. So let's keep carrying this work forward. And thank you so much. Give love to all our panelists, please. And we'll see you out there as we do this work.